Hello and welcome to Trinity Talk Live. I'm Ken Coughlin.
I'm Ben Lander.
I'm Jay.
We have a special guest today. Jay from Ohio has decided to come on the show.
Very nice.
Isn't it though? So I saw that Ohio was like spiking though. Are people allowed to travel?
Everywhere is a spiking except for Maryland, which is nice.
It is nice. We're in the right place, isn't it?
Right.
So we can't leave Maryland.
No, that is true.
Which,
Can't leave or go anywhere.
we're stuck in Maryland forever. Sorry, I've gotten to the point where I've lived in Maryland longer than I lived in Virginia. And you ever have one of the things where it's like Virginia still is my home state. I mean, that's where I grew up, and even though I realized a little while ago, no, I've lived in Maryland longer than I've actually lived in Virginia. But
I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I haven't quite met that threshold yet, but still, yeah.
it's getting kind of close.
It's getting close.
Yeah. So anyway, well, thank you for joining us here on Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a couple of native Marylanders. No. We kind of blew that. None of us actually are, apparently. No, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. If it's your first time watching, thank you very much for joining us today. The way this show works is basically this is a bunch of folks, in this case 3 today, sitting around a table and talking about whatever people are talking about out there in the world. What makes this show unique is that we are all Christians, and we are doing it from a Christian perspective. There's no shortage out there of news outlets, if you want to call them that, media outlets, internet outlets that will tell you anything you want to hear about whatever story is going on, but sometimes may be difficult hearing a Christian perspective on it. That's what we strive to bring you. We're not special. We might be right, we might be wrong, but we're going to do our best to bring a Christian perspective onto these issues. So with that being said, please, in addition to the 3 scholarly minds we have up here that are going to give our take on it, we'd like to hear from your scholarly mind out there as well. So we are live right now both on YouTube, on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel, and on Facebook, on the Trinity Joppa Facebook page. And please feel free to utilize the live chat on YouTube or the comments on Facebook and chime in with your thoughts on anything that we're talking about here today. Agree with us, disagree with us, have a question, just have a thought, put it in there. And while we are going through the show, I will be monitoring both Facebook and YouTube right here on this lovely computer. And I would be happy to read your comments live on the air, read your questions. If you have a question, we can answer it, give you our thoughts live on the air. Good summary. I got it all in, right?
Sounds good, yeah.
All right, and subscribe. Throw that in there. All right. So we are going to get started today with our first story, and our first story is it is the season for Supreme Court cases. It seems like. I mean, it is. This is when they always seem to come down around this time. In this case, it was a case of them actually denying a petition. The United States Supreme Court on last Friday. Well, yeah, I guess it was last Friday. This past Friday that just passed, denied a petition from a church in Nevada. And what happened is Nevada had instituted a 50-person limit on church attendance, so that if you were attending church, you can only have up to 50 people in attendance. Similar to what we had when this whole virus started, where we were limited to 10 people at a time, but they are still apparently limited to 50 people at a time. The catch is, and the reason that several of these churches objected, is that not every organization is limited to the 50-person attendance. It was things like churches, it was large concerts, things like that, but things that were not, shall we say, assigned seating type venues, like casinos is the big one, were not limited to 50 people. And so the churches objected, say you're not treating churches the same way you are other organizations, and so we think that this is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, with Chief Justice Roberts joining the liberal bloc of I hate using that, but what's considered they were appointed by Democratic presidents, let's put it that way. He joined them in a 5-4 decision to say, no, it's not unconstitutional. Nevada is allowed to limit church attendance to 50 people. So I will say right off the bat, Jeanette Harrington. Hello, Jeanette. Jeanette has commented on YouTube saying, good afternoon, watching while on vacation, waiting to hear your topics and may tune in later. All right. Cool. Thank you, Jeanette. So who wants to start the lovely discussion on this Nevada case? Is there an incorrect distinction being made here or not?
Well, it's very similar to what we've seen before in the case, I believe it was in California, right? Mm-hmm. The other church that came against the Supreme Court, and that decision was also turned down by the Supreme Court, so this makes number 2. It's kind of a recurring theme. And you had made the comment in that episode that we talked about it, where if it were the same law being applied to all cases, then there wouldn't really be a case. However, it does seem in some instances where it's disproportional, such as the casinos are not having to follow the 50-person rule, whereas churches are. And same thing in California, where it seems like it was applied to all venues, because that's the way it was listed in the mandate. But then it's that same governor in California, Governor Gavin Newsom, I believe, who tweeted later about the protests, saying that they have a right to protest, where clearly he's endorsing these protests where many more people, and even in California it said not just indoor but outdoor gatherings as well. So there is an inconsistency there. So I think the church does have a case that there seems to be, at least on the surface, it should be applied to all, but doesn't seem that that's what's happening.
In the follow-up briefing, did he give a reason why they upheld?
Well, the reasoning.
That tells us.
Yeah, I mean, the reasoning being was that for the majority was basically kind of what I hinted at when I was reading it, is that it doesn't single out churches. Other things like concert halls, for example, concerts, things like that, were also limited to the 50-person limit. But then that begs the question of, well, is there a relevant difference between 50 people gathering in a seated area as opposed to 50 people gathering around the slot machines at a casino? I would suggest that no, actually the casino is probably a bigger concern. At least if I come in, if you have a controlled seating area, you can betterly ensure social distancing. Betterly? That's not a word. Better ensure social distancing. Concert halls can have assigned seats. And so even if you are putting people at risk, for the most part, you're putting people at risk that are in closest proximity to you, not everyone, whereas in a casino where people are constantly on the move and milling about, there's certainly more opportunity for spreading. So I would argue that the distinction kind of falls apart, and if anything, you would think it would go the other way around. But what I did want to read very quickly, and this is Justice Gorsuch's dissent rather. His dissenting opinion is literally one paragraph long. But I saw this, circulating, and I thought it kind of summarizes the opposite view, the opposing view, pretty well. He says this is a simple case. Under the governor's edict, a 10-screen multiplex may host 500 moviegoers at any time. A casino, too, so I guess I'm wrong. Movie theaters were allowed to be open, so that's interesting. So a casino, too, may cater to hundreds at once, with perhaps 6 people huddled at each craps table here and a similar number gathered around every roulette wheel there. Large numbers and close quarters are fine in such places, but churches, synagogues, and mosques are banned from admitting more than 50 worshipers, no matter how large the building, how distant the individuals, how many wear face masks, no matter the precautions at all. In Nevada, it seems, it is better to be in entertainment than religion. Maybe that is nothing new, but the First Amendment prohibits such obvious discrimination against the exercise of religion. The world we inhabit today, with a pandemic upon us, poses unusual challenges, but there is no world in which the Constitution permits Nevada to favor Caesar's Palace over Calvary Chapel. And I think there's a distinction in my mind about that we've talked before. Let's say, because there's a lot of churches that say we want to open and we want to have everybody come in. They don't want to. They think the coronavirus isn't real or whatever. And I will take issue with that as well. And we've talked before about a distinction in my mind as a lawyer between what the churches should do in loving our neighbor and what the state should be permitted to force them to do. Right. And so that's my concern, I guess, when I read things like this is, like you mentioned that, they have a right to protest. And we do. We have a First Amendment right to protest. There's also a First Amendment right to exercise your religion, to the free exercise of religion, and that sometimes in these decisions, when you look at and you say, well, we're not treating churches differently because you're being treated the same as like concerts. Okay, but there isn't a constitutional right to attend concerts. Right. There is one to worship, and so there should be a difference there in my mind. And should we still be controlling and doing everything we can as a church to be responsible, to love our neighbors, to not gather in huge, gatherings, all close proximity, all that? Yes, we absolutely should. But decisions like this worry me a little bit.
They do, and they should. And let me just play advocate, because we've had these conversations among pastors and those kind of things. Right? Yeah. And so if we want to be good citizens, we want to be good, court cases aside.
Right.
If they're limiting to 50 people, are you still limiting the exercise of your religion? I guess is what I'm saying. We are making choices in some cases to not even gather, and yet the church is not, quote unquote, closed. It's quite simply, we still have the freedom to practice our religion. We just aren't gathering in mass places. So I understand the difference, and there is the gathering in community and the mutual edification, all those kind of points. So I don't want to downplay any of that.
Right.
But that's why I was asking if he stated anything in particular. We are not limiting your ability to worship, but we are limiting your ability to gather. And is there a difference? Because like I said, pastors are having these hard conversations. We want to make a statement because we feel churches are more essential than casinos, obviously. Then you get into the whole economy-driven versus, faith-driven, but which is could take us down that hole. But I guess the point is, are we limiting? Is it truly limiting our ability to worship our God, which is the freedom that we have in that separation of church and state, versus just the ability to gather? And that's the only reason I want to lift it up, because I can see both sides of that. For me, even though we're not gathering, I love seeing people. I'm an extrovert. I feed off of people, and I struggle to be isolated, even though I love my wife and kids to death. I mean, it's just one of those things. It's one of those that you have to wrestle with that, because we are not. In many cases, churches are thriving online,
yeah.
And so it's really where you're wired, or where your true worship piece is, which gets you back to is it the building, is it the church, or versus is it God? And so just to kind of throw some of those variables out there.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I would agree that the church is not the building, it's the people, absolutely. And so, we're not being restricted in our ability to worship, because we still have those capabilities to worship online. So that's absolutely, and we've been doing that here at Trinity.
And they can gamble online too.
That's true.
So let's not go there.
I think in this case, however, it's more about not necessarily the restrictions on churches. It's more about a unsettling precedent for unfair treatment of church as opposed to other businesses.
Well, and I guess that gets to my point before. That's the one thing that bothers me about it is, I'm uncomfortable with the government taking too much, taking a step too far as trying to control what churches do. Here's why I will absolutely agree with you is, and this gets back to my point earlier about, churches that are looking to just gather, it's business as usual. I'm going to have some words with you, in all good Christian love, because for a lot of those same reasons, it's like, that's not being loving of your neighbor, and you don't need the building to worship, just like we were talking about with the Hagia or Hagia Sophia thing, a couple of weeks ago. It's like it is ultimately just a building. It's not the church. It's not essential for worship. But I also look, and this is, I guess, leaving aside the religious aspects of it. Just I hate illogical anything. And we talked about this even when we were having the 10-person limit here. It's like a hard 50-person limit. Why?
Where does it come from?
Where's that come from?
Right.
Because if I've got a building that seats 2,000 people, that can only is limited to 50. The same as someone with a capacity of 50.
Right. Right. And I just wonder if there's the perception that churches, they're not all mega churches. A lot of them are smaller, little tinier churches that don't have the circulation and don't have a lot of those kind of things to do. I'm not justifying it. I really wish they would have said why, and more in particular that they chose to uphold this from that standpoint, or why they even chose to place it to begin with. I think would really kind of help us understand a little bit more of that, because if they are being consistent and other places of that are being shut down, then okay. But I think the big inconsistency is, you're right, casinos drive the economy. And the economy is sluggish and have to get jobs out there. And so you give grace to the economy and not to worship. And it's a double standard that, you're right, quite frankly, is going to continue to deepen, I believe, during this whole time. We're going to see, and this is maybe our way of being persecuted, if you want to look at it in those ways.
Yeah, I sometimes hate to use those terms because I think they get overused sometimes by Christians here in America. It's like, you really, and we had oh my gosh, Mary Kay, do you remember what his name was? I'm gonna feel horrible about this because it's been a while since he was on the show. I want to say his first name was Robert. He was an overseas missionary who was in Pakistan, I believe he traveled to, and What's that? Robert Batista was his name, yeah. And he had, and he shared some stories with us when he was on the show a long time ago about what he'd seen over there. It's like, that's persecution. Okay,
Right,
you know?
right. Ours is just uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable. But we are still we still live in a great country. But at the same time, I don't want to diminish when we do see things that cause concern. Call them out because
Correct,
you
because
don't
it'll
want
continue
things to
to
get
go down.
progressively
Right.
worse.
Exactly. Yeah, that's how things didn't happen in Pakistan overnight. It
Right.
was a gradual
Exactly.
kind of take.
So, but I do think that
Things
when you see
didn't
things like this,
happen overnight with Hitler either. He
Right.
pushed the
Right.
envelope,
Oh,
and he
exactly.
pushed the envelope. Nobody said anything, and then eventually he's in France.
But so that's that. I guess the concern here is that is there an overall impression throughout Indian American culture nowadays that we're starting to see grow that churches aren't essential, that aren't the economy is what's important, churches aren't as necessary, which kind of could be a lead in into our next story. You see what I did there? Right? That's called a segue. So Ben, what's our second story?
So our second story comes from Christian News Now, and it's a study by the Pew Research Center. So again, one of these larger studies that was done. And it says that most Americans and world say belief in God isn't necessary to be moral and have good values. So this is a study that was spanned over 34 countries and it interviewed or polled 38,000 people, 38,426 for those who want to be precise. And it's too much to read on the air here, but just to surmise, it...
Summarize, you mean?
Isn't surmise a good summarize? I'm sorry. Summarize. We each get one. Just to summarize.
I got to make up a word.
You got to make a word. I made up a word. Ben's made up a
All
word.
right.
Your turn.
I'm working on it.
It kind of shows this graphic where it's interesting in that in some countries it's very much leans one way, and in other countries it very much leans the other one. And it trends toward those countries that are more developed tend to agree with that statement that belief in God is not necessary for morality. And that's kind of the premise of this study is, equating belief in God with morality, and do we need that? So what are your thoughts? We can
I'm gonna let you
get
go
philosophical here.
Let me go first.
Yeah, you go first.
There's a big softball thrown. Well, who defines morality at that point?
Who does?
Well,
I think
okay,
it was,
you went first.
So again, but I think that's what we're coming to. In the countries like Indonesia and Philippines that are 96% say that belief in God influences their morality, those are also lifestyle countries,
Yep.
if we look at it in that way. So religion is a lifestyle, and of course that's going to translate. For the Western cultures like Sweden and the United States, Sweden is 90% against, they say 90% of them say you don't need a God in order to have quote-unquote moral values, or they don't influence it. It's really just they have choices. And so this is where Ben was kind of talking about the more developed countries like the United States. Canada is 73%. They don't believe, 73% don't believe that you have to have a God in order to make moral decisions. Who makes those decisions decides on morality, because then you get down to the point where is abortion moral or not. In our country, it's not a moral decision. Right? So we've gotten into those things. For Christianity, most strands, some strands.
Be careful.
I'm not going down that road, but for our strand, it is a moral decision. It is a life decision from that standpoint. So I think you have to define what morality is. You also have to define all these variables, but the underlying piece is the more advanced your country is, can do free thinking and have the choices, the more churches and God are relegated to just a choice instead of a lifestyle. If that's the correlation we can kind of draw from here. All the African countries that are underdeveloped, and you have to grasp onto hope. That's I think maybe some of the other thing you need a savior, you need a hope or a deity that's going to help guide you through this, because we're not just talking Christianity, Islam, India. 74% of that, and of course we know where Hinduism and all that is part of. So we're talking about God being a quote-unquote deity, not our God that we see in Christianity. These are all ways for them to understand what morality is based on their lifestyle.
Well, yeah, you raise India as a good point. If the question is, do you need to believe in God to have have a good value system? And just think of that question to being asked in India alone.
Right.
I mean, what kind of response are you going to get? How many different perceptions are you going to have of what the question even means? And for those who don't know about Hinduism, which obviously is part and parcel of the culture in India, the notions of the deity, the divine, even within Hinduism, are vastly varied.
Which God? Do you mean Krishna, Brahma?
Yeah. Or are you just talking about the impersonal?
Yeah.
But anyway, so
And they still have their caste system, though, which is also, the lower you are in the caste system, the more you rely on a deity to help you move up.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of variables in that. The biggest piece is if you have a choice to follow God or not, your choice, it seems to be one of those. As long as we have a choice, then God isn't as influential in our lives as it would be in other places. I think
Tim Foster says here on Facebook, a fool says in their heart there is no God. Obviously, it's scripture, so I agree with that.
Right. That's our Bible.
Now, let me. You say it depends on how you define morality. Now I'm going to define morality. No, not really. But I'm going to. I might surprise some people out there. Probably not you guys, because you've heard me say this before. The headline suggesting, do you need to believe in God to have a quote-unquote good value system? And I'm taking good to mean what other humans would consider to be good moral values, not what God considers to be good moral values. That's a different distinction entirely. But what other human beings would consider to be a good value system. And I will say the definitive answer to that is no. You don't need to believe in God to have a personal value system that most people in your surrounding culture would consider to be a good value system. Agreed. There's a really good video on reasonable. What? I'm supposed to look at this camera now. Hi, camera. I know we need to get cameras with tally lights on them. With these cameras, for those of you that are at all technically inclined, you might know what tally lights are. Those little lights that come on that tell you which camera is actually live over the live stream right now. We don't have that on our camera, so we have no idea which camera is live going out. Anyway, so there's a really good video on William Lane Craig's website, Reasonable Faith, where he has a little cartoon that asks this exact same question. It says, do you need to believe in God to have good moral values? And it has, and I've kind of made plays on it in some of the classes that I've taught, where you have little Joe Atheist walks up to a tree, and there's a cat in the tree. And he looks up and he sees the cat. And look, little Joe Atheist climbs the tree, gets the cat, rescues the cat out of the tree. There you go, definitive proof you don't need to believe in God to have a good set of moral values. The reason I like that example is because it illustrates a red herring that gets thrown out there to critical of Christianity an awful lot. When a lot of Christians will say, myself included, that there's this, I won't go into what it is, but there's this moral argument for God, that morality proves that God must exist. But what we're not saying that you, in order to believe murder is wrong, you have to believe in God first.
Right.
I mean, culture plays a role. Your surrounding culture is going to, and let's face it, our culture, the Judeo-Christian history, it did play a prominent role in shaping our culture. How much, we'll debate another day, but it did play a prominent role in shaping our culture. And so a lot of the cultural values that have developed here in America, not in all respects, obviously, but in some respects, are mirror what
they do reflect the Ten Commandments.
Right, exactly.
In many ways, right.
And so people, as a result of their cultural influences, are going to believe certain things that may be the same things that we as Christians believe. The distinction is this: morality as a concept, it's objective morality, meaning that it's not just a matter of opinion. Murder, rape, these things are actually wrong. Not just like, you prefer one flavor of ice cream, I prefer another. Right. You prefer murder, I prefer not to murder. No, that's not what morality is. If we're going to say murder is actually wrong, that idea doesn't make sense unless unless God exists to form the basis for that. And so that's the distinction. But anyway.
Yeah, no, and that actually was exactly the point I was going to make. I think it was Dostoevsky talks about in one of his books. He says that if God
that's not a made-up word, by the way. That's a real guy.
Yeah, Dostoevsky. It's a philosophical argument, but he says if God does not exist, then anything is permissible, right? You need a standard. That's why there's objective good. You need a standard, because if an atheist says something is good or bad, really what they're saying is, like you were saying, it's like ice cream. It's preferable or not preferable. It's preferable to be alive, which is why it's bad to kill people. And you look at, and I'm going to illustrate, and this is probably going to get morbid for a second, but kind of to illustrate my point, if you look at societies. And the penalty for murder universally is far worse than the penalty for, say, desecrating a corpse, right? It's because life, there's something about that intrinsic value of life, the intrinsic value of the person. And I don't think atheism can really answer that if the value of the person isn't found outside of just whatever comprises your physical body. And so there needs to be something outside of us that is an objective rule to which we look to say things are good or bad, permissible or not permissible.
Well, and I just use the example lots of time. I've had, two people walking down the street, or it's a person walking down the street, somebody jumps out of an alley and punches them in the face. And they say, after saying ow, they get back up and they say, wow, I think you shouldn't have done that. I think that was legally wrong according to the laws of our land. I'm going to sue you. And the person that punched him says, no, I think it was legally right. And he says, no, legally wrong, legally right, legally wrong, legally right. Those are their opinions. Mm-hmm. Now is there a place they can look to decide which of their opinions is actually right and which is actually wrong? Well, sure there is. They can open up the law book and see what the law actually says, all right? Mm-hmm. Now just change the example a little bit and you say, okay, now they're saying, well, I think you were morally right to hit me. No, I think it was, or morally wrong. No, morally right, morally wrong, morally wrong. Right, I can't talk. But now is there a place from the moral law where they can look to decide, which of their opinions is actually correct? And if we're going to say that there is, that one of them is right and one of them is wrong, well, you need something above them, similar to that law book you need, on the civil law. Otherwise, it makes no sense. It's just
so, and like in Romans 1, when Paul talks about, he says, for what can be known about God is plain to them, talking about unbelievers, or everybody really, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible qualities, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. In other words, Paul's using this argument, saying that God is that place that we turn to, and his invisible qualities, he's written on the hearts of people, right? That's why we tend to have a natural inclination to say that something is wrong or right. Duffy Robbins, one of my mentors, he always used to say, if somebody tells you that there's no such thing as right or wrong, steal their iPad. They'll tell you right away that was wrong. And so there's this intrinsic barometer that we all kind of have, and Scripture tells us, because God has made it plain to us.
And that's the end of that conversation. So, all right. And on that note, let's move on to story number 3. What do you say?
Sure.
All right. So story number 3 comes out of Texas. There's a pastor by the name of Ed Young, who, and I don't know, I saw the story. I don't know if you guys got the opportunity. I'll chime in a minute, because I actually did get to go back and watch the actual video of his sermon or his comments on this. But he was giving a sermon where he warned what he called woke Christians against jumping too quickly on cultural hype trains. And essentially what he said was that, there's these hype trains that come up in our cultures, and lots of times people want to jump on board because the culture is saying this is the right thing to do. And the overall point he was making was, hold on before you do that, compare it against Scripture, and make sure it's scriptural. He went on to give a number of examples. He says that he claimed were cultural hype trains. He says our culture applauds things that are connected to relativism, abortion, transgenderism, the breakup of the nuclear family. But then he said one particular example of a hype train is the Black Lives Matter movement. And then he went on to say, I wholeheartedly agree with the phrase, I believe in it and the church should champion it. We should stand up for equality and justice. I believe we need to lead out. But I can't support or agree with the core beliefs of the organization Black Lives Matter. And I'm reading this according to the article that I got this from, and I'm going to comment on that in a second. He says the organization, it's tied to abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, and the breakup of the nuclear family, just to name a few. So I'm not going to hashtag the phrase, because whenever someone hashtags something, they need to hash it out through Scripture. Now, I'll start on this one because I did go back and actually watch the video. I'd seen something else where it was commented and saying how people were criticizing him because he didn't appreciate the difference between the movement and the organization, and understanding, the black. And I agree with. It amazes me how many people don't recognize this. Black Lives Matter we were all around when this hashtag started. I mean, it was, I'm forgetting the gentleman's name. Freddie Gray. Was it? No, it was before Freddie Gray.
Trayvon Martin.
Oh, yeah,
Trayvon Martin was the first
George
one, I think.
Zimmerman, yeah.
Where it started out as exactly that. It was a hashtag that people were using on social media, Black Lives Matter. Now, after that, an organization, formed, and 2013, thank you, and for lack of a better word, co-opted the term. All right, they used the term that was already in circulation. The movement was already going on, and they created this organization. Now, the organization, yes, does stand for a lot of things that we as Christians are going to disagree with. I mean, they've been described as Marxist, and there's a lot of other things in their platform we look at that we're going to disagree with. This article made it sound like Pastor Ed Young was trying to make that distinction. I don't know if you guys got a chance to go back.
I just want to correct it. It was Mike Brown. When Mike Brown was killed by
but
a
my
police
point
officer
is
in
that
Ferguson.
long before 2013, it was
Yeah.
going around. I went back and watched the video, and I got to
No,
say,
wait, that was in 2014
okay.
when I don't know, I'd have to.
The movement pre-existed the organization. All right.
Yes.
So
does.
anyway, so I went back and I watched the video, and I got to say, because he was being criticized, saying, well, you weren't appreciating the difference between the organization and the movement, and apparently the response was, yes, I did. Didn't you hear me say that I agree with the movement but not the organization? I went back and watched the video, and that's not actually what he said. Okay. I mean, he did quite clearly say, I disagree with the values of the movement. He said, I agree with the words, but I disagree with the values of the movement. And so here's what I'm going to throw out there, and I may get a lot of people angry. Sorry, Tim, I just noticed Tim Foster here just commented on, I'm sorry, Tim, I didn't see when it popped up, so I'm not sure which story you were commenting on here, but he says, Luke 12:51, do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. We can get into that in a minute if you guys want to. I think that's a verse that's worthy of fleshing out a little bit. But here's my beef that I'm going to give my 2 cents to a lot of the Christian world out there. And like I said, you can agree with me, disagree with me, what you want. Here's my problem with the way a lot of things are being presented nowadays. First of all, I do think that people are getting sloppy in not distinguishing the movement from the organization.
Yes.
I think a lot of people are, when they talk about, I can't support Black Lives Matter because if I support Black Lives Matter, I'm not supporting X. And whatever X is, of course, it's listing off something from the website of this particular organization, all right? So I think we need, as Christians, need to be responsible. I mean, truth matters, all right? Honesty matters. And in my mind, when you say that if you support Black Lives Matter, you are therefore supporting something else, I don't personally think that's being honest. At a minimum, it's not researching and being aware of the history and giving the full information, all right? So I do think we need to be careful because I think, if you think about it, the whole problem that they're supposedly trying to address is when you go out there and you say you're supporting Black Lives Matter, you don't know that you're really also supporting these other things. Well, then that means that these majority of these people who are out there supporting Black Lives Matter aren't knowingly supporting these other things, And so we do need to understand that there are a lot of people that are going out there that are saying they support Black Lives Matter, but they don't mean that they're supporting all these other things. They mean just that they're trying to strive for racial justice and racial equality, all right? Now, do I think that we as Christians could and should, call out organizations like this that stand for things we don't stand for? Yes, I don't have a problem with that, all right? I guess where I have a problem with it is, number one, when we make this false equivalency between the organization and the movement, and number two, where in light of everything else that's going on, that we make that our primary focus. If you were to look at it this way, I think right now the call of the Christian church is to be loving to our neighbor, to listen to those who are suffering, to figure out how we can help, and to show empathy, like we've talked about a lot in the show already, to understand things that maybe we aren't in a position, we don't understand because we haven't experienced them. That's the headline, so to speak. Now, when we're talking about that headline, if in the context of that you want to throw in, I hate to use the word footnote, but you know what I mean, a subset, a subcategory, a subheading that says, and by the way, while you're doing this, don't get confused by this. Don't get confused by this organization. I'm okay with that. Where I have the problem is I think and it kind of gets back to some of what we were talking about, I think, was it last week, where people, sometimes we get so caught up in pointing out other people's sin that we use it as an excuse not to look in on our own. I have a problem because I see too many trends, I think, going the other way around, where it's like our headline's going to be, let's call out this one particular organization, and oh, by the way, yeah, we should also love our neighbor, and we should also do these other things. So that's, and that's when I saw Pastor Young's comments, and again, I didn't see the whole sermon. I saw whatever excerpts were posted online, so I'm open to the fact that there may be more, and I may be misunderstanding something. But the impression I got was, yeah, I agree that organization stands for these things that I don't agree with, but is that really what our headline should be right now? Or should that be the subheading, if that makes sense? That may make no sense whatsoever. That's my thoughts. Go.
I was just going to say, if so when you're saying we should be careful not to conflate the organization and the movement, but when it's already been so mingled in our culture, how do we separate those two? What is the difference?
I don't have a problem speaking out against it, but that's kind of my point. Let's put yourself in the shoes for a moment of someone who was tweeting Black Lives Matter from the get-go, before the organization ever existed, and all you've ever wanted that movement to be is to support racial equality. All right. Then some organization comes along and says, oh, we're going to use the name Black Lives Matter, and we're going to have all these other causes that have nothing to do with black lives at all. A lot of them don't. How would you feel? I mean, how would you feel at that point? And I agree with you that lots of times our culture is, and it's the fault of that organization. I mean, I'm going to put it where it lies. It's the fault of that organization for taking that name and taking it to add all these extra things to it, which caused it to lose focus on the original intention of the movement. And so I agree that in some minds it's getting conflated, but you know what? Some of that's our fault, and I mean us as the Christian church, because I'm sorry, when I see messages like Pastor Young was preaching, where he said point blank, I oppose to the values of the movement, and the values he was talking about were the things that were espoused by that organization, he's fostering that intermingling as opposed to serving to separate it and say, here's what we absolutely should be standing for and can agree with. And it's, by the way, what this movement was originally about. Let's take it back to its roots, if that makes sense.
Right. So when the movement's been hijacked, I think I do agree with what you were saying. We should be. It's been said before. Christians are more so known for what we're against rather than what we're for. We should be emphasizing what we're for, and then like you said, we've gotten things reversed, calling people out. So maybe that's a suggestion, is to emphasize what we're for and emphasize what the movement was intended to be, and not all of these other things.
Well, and I do, my mic keeps turning here. Sorry if I'm causing noise in people's ears. And it was Pastor Nunez who was here for the Faithful Conversations, the event we had, who actually, I think, and I apologize if I'm misquoting him, but I believe he actually said he tries to avoid using phrases of any kind like that for this reason, because
they just create divisions and subcultures and those kind of pieces. That's really what we're seeing. It truly is. We if you're going to identify and use those kind of things, and yet at the same time he was at a Black Lives Matter march, so right. I mean he wants to support what that truly means. But to your point exactly, how do we speak for things and the culture doesn't tell us, just because we're speaking for something, or they're saying you have to use this terminology, and we're not saying that because I haven't used that terminology at all, and I simply speak from, we are made in God's image, we are all equal, those are the things. But the culture is saying that's not enough. You have to identify the sin. And I agree that you do have to identify the sin, because we don't do it. Quite frankly, this is where we're at too. Again, I'm taking sticks and taking them out of my own eye and throwing them at other people to see. But we have to understand, how do you speak to love to that, and not in combativeness? Because I think that's the approach. And yet, you're right. Tim's exact phrase I'm here to create division. In some ways, if you're sticking to your guns of what Christianity means to you, you're going to get some of these kind of things. You're going to have division. So I think this is where both sides are wrestling with this. Even the loving Christian sides are saying enough is enough. We want to simply love one another. You're screaming at me, I have to use this terminology in order to do it. And if you don't, then you're not fighting it. And I think that's the wrong approach as well. It's an either or, and we don't deal in either ors necessarily. We deal in love, and so love is one of those things that embraces all sides and walks together in all sides.
But speaking of terms that have been co-opted, I mean, let's talk about the co-option of the term love and how it applies in the Christian
all
church.
love matters, right?
Well,
I know,
and that's been taken by a lot of folks, I'll just say, to
Correct.
think that to create almost like a universalism. It's like anything goes. You determine your own morality. Everybody's going to go to heaven. You know, loving God would let everybody in.
Right.
You know,
And going back to our other story, when we remove that standard, then anything is permissible.
right?
And as soon as everything is, then nothing is sacred.
Yeah.
If everything is sacred, then nothing is sacred.
Yeah.
So you're right.
If everyone's super, no one is.
Incredibles reference.
Had to. Tim Foster does say here, and he posted this earlier when I was talking about the organization versus the movement. He says, BLM core belief about nuclear family. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. And he says the organization is tricking people into feeling like a racist. Right. And Tim, that's an example. It's kind of like, I think the devil works sometimes through half-truths, you know. And first of all, I would say that that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's a core belief of the organization. The movement wasn't about all that. It didn't have, when it started out, it was just about racial equality, you know. But you look at even what this quote says, it's like, should we collectively care for each other? Yes,
Absolutely.
Absolutely we should. That's what the Christian.
This is what we.
But does that replace the nuclear family and the roles of fathers and mothers in raising their children?
Right.
You can have both. Those don't have to be an either or. I hate saying it because I'm a logician, so either or can mean one thing.
Well, even the choice that they use in there, we disrupt. That seems to me intentional. To use the word, disrupt. What we're seeing is a culture war that's played out, and the weapons are language. Forcing you to use certain rhetoric or to avoid certain rhetoric from seeming like you're supporting one thing or another, or you are, and you just slap labels onto everybody, and it just becomes so much easier to distance.
And it's working
yourself
out. It's working in our culture. I mean, if you don't stand up for something, you are yelled down for not standing up for it. I mean, we are being put into boxes of belief, of which God is no longer framing our morality and our we're not, and so we are truly seeing what we talked about
in the last story.
In that last story,
you take that out of the picture, and anything
remove
goes.
God enough, who defines your morality?
Yep.
Well,
and who defines what matters?
And Tim posted here, I will abstain posting their belief about sexuality. I want to keep the discussion clean. Thank you,
Yes,
Tim.
yeah.
But it's funny because I get in discussions sometimes with people about atheist regimes that have exist in history and some of the atrocities that have been committed by atheist regimes. And one of the points that I've often made is just because you're an atheist regime, does that necessarily mean you're going to be killing large swaths of people? No, it doesn't. But are you being consistent with your worldview if you do that? You can't say it's inconsistent when you don't have a foundation for morality to begin with. Right. And so I'm not comparing everything we got going on in our culture today to the worst atheist regimes of history. Don't get me wrong. All I'm showing is it's a principle that we do see carrying over. That is, if you do remove God, then who is it that's left to decide what's right and what's wrong? Well, it's just us. That's all. And so anything goes.
And it's all subjective, yeah.
Yeah, it's all subjective, and that's what we start to see and getting into. So anyway, but yeah, I just,
I think it's worth just saying openly, do your due diligence before you post something online, because we live in a
meme culture.
We live in a meme culture. We live in a culture of affirmation. Mm-hmm. So if you want to find something that is going to absolutely prove your position, you can find it, you can post it, you can send it all out there. You've got to just understand the bigger picture. And when the scripture challenges us or challenges my own view on something, let it challenge us instead of saying, you know what, I'll find something else that will back it up. We're not allowing scripture to inform our lives. We are informing how we are reading scripture. And this is where we're running into some of these issues.
And I think we as Christians, and especially pastors, not calling you out, calling out Pastor Young. We need to be responsible. I know you're not. I get it, but we need to be. We all need to strive to do that because, like I said, we live in a meme culture, and unfortunately, our society wants to formulate their opinions based upon 5-second sound bites at most, and so and
That's all we have time for.
That's all. Well, yeah. But we need to do better because it's that kind of mentality that leads to something like this. That leads to him just saying, Black Lives Matter and talking very generically and not taking the time to be clear about what important distinctions that are out there. And when he just says, well, I don't agree with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then you hear what he's saying, it's okay, well, what you're actually saying is you don't agree with these particular platforms of this organization, and I can agree with you on that. But we got to be careful not to equate paint with too broad of a brush so that we're saying everybody who's in the Black Lives Matter movement supports all of this and create a false equivalency, because then we're not listening. We're not listening to people and hearing what they're actually saying. It was great. I love both Nikki Lerner and Pastor Nunez. But another thing that Pastor Nunez said was, you don't agree with Black Lives Matter. You don't agree with the organization. That's fine. I'm here talking to you right now. Listen to me. Listen to me. That is, I think, the philosophy that I would love to see spread throughout the Christian church. Just sit down, talk to an individual, and listen to them. Don't get caught up in all this memes about what this term means or that term means. Listen to people, and then let's see how we can show love and move forward. So, all right, last story of the day, shall we, sir?
Oh, let me pull it up.
Fun.
1 second.
As a result of.
Yeah, right. So this all kind of trends toward. As a result of the unrest, this is actually the patch. This is a local story. Thank you, Pastor Jay, for suggesting it.
Yeah, if you don't like it, it's his fault.
No, it's good to do. We talk about things that are kind of what's going on in our. Typically, it's national news, but it's nice to have something local here that ties in. But I say nice, but. I'll just read the story.
Stop before you get into that, because I don't want to get ahead. Tim Foster made another comment. It's hard because they're like 30 second delayed. He just said, this is where we as Christians are per Jesus. John 15:18. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. And obviously there's going to be an opposition to a lot of what we stand for as Christians, and Jesus told us to expect that. The question I think that I challenge Christians out there is, okay, how do we respond to that? And I won't say anything more. That's
Sure.
So anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it all goes back to speaking the truth in love. Yeah. Right. So okay. Anyway, this our last story comes from the Baltimore patch, or it's actually the Bel Air patch, and this is Vince's Crab House. It's a local chain. They have about 5 restaurants, I believe. But he's suing Baltimore County over protests. So what had happened was the owner of Vince's had. Posted something. I don't know if it says on here whether it was Facebook or some social media, but he made a post, Vince Meyer, and then as a response to that during the protests, there was a lot of backlash, which caused him to close down 9 of his stores for 9 days, and then upon reopening, they had to hire their own private security because the Baltimore police were told to stand down. That's his accusation. And now he's suing Baltimore County for restitution from having to pay all that money plus the damages that the business has suffered. So I don't know if you want me to read his actual post.
I think we should.
The actual post that was in question is that he had said, "There is one place that I bet protesters and rioters won't light on fire or break into or even block the road to, the social services building." So that was the initial post, and there was a lot of backlash from it.
I wonder why.
Go.
You can start this one.
If you're going to say something, be ready for and like this talks to speaking in love. I don't think that was in love, but if you are going to end up making statements like that, then prepare to have reactions, I guess is what I would say. But the whole other point is, should they provide protection for that? And,
where does reaction, I guess, that's the question. We're saying this, and talk about taking a local story and expanding it nationwide.
Right.
Where does reaction cross the line? And the story was kind of vague, other than it talked a little bit about what their accusations were.
Right.
Saying that they've been subjected to death threats,
Death threats
assaults,
and
followed to their homes, harassment on their private property. I love that term as a lawyer, harassment. What does that mean?
Because we've seen throughout the course of history protests in front of buildings and those kinds
Right.
of, we've seen that, and they become, either effective or not. They haven't turned violent as far as I know, this one didn't turn violent.
That's my question.
Right,
That's my
the accusation.
Right. That's what because if his businesses were suffering, he got upset because there were protesters out there for I don't know how many weeks it's been now. It's been a long time, like 4 weeks or something like that. There's been protesters who have very consistently been picketing his business.
Right.
That's their right, and the police shouldn't break that up.
Right.
Now, if they're getting to the point where they're trespassing, if they're getting to the point where they're being violent, they're breaking things, that's different. And so,
Which leads to the question: is the threat of violence itself? Because they're threatening. He has all these death threats, and so
Right.
do the police have
An obligation.
obligation to protect him if those threats are to be taken seriously?
right. Well, I guess here's the question: is the police? I don't think have an obligation to be like permanently stationed outside his restaurants. They don't. We can't expect that in any circumstance. They just don't have the manpower, or the person power, or whatever, to do that. All right. Do they have the responsibility to respond when criminal activity happens? Yes, they do. The problem with things like death threats is you got to think about it. You got a large crowd, and you hear something out of the crowd saying, "Hey, I'm going to kill you." What are the police supposed to do? I mean, if you don't know who said it, yes, there are limits on free speech when it comes to certain things like that. But you still, in other words, there's a practical element to it as well.
And I think the underlying piece that he's probably trying to get to is that rioting and defaming and all those are okay, and the police are standing down. The perception is.
Right.
I mean, they're severely outmanned in many ways, so we keep them in prayer from that standpoint. But, at what point, do they pull them away from to protect your thing if you're paying them? Sure. I mean, from that standpoint. But it's not easy to even understand.
Yeah.
Because
I just think there's a lot. When people see stories like this, I think the tendency to talk about that meme culture we want our opinions and we want them now.
Just a soundbite.
You don't. Yeah, exactly. You don't take the time to look through the depth, the layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Sorry, I'm just doing movie references left and right here today. You don't take the time to strip it down and see things from other people's perspectives. Okay, what exactly is going on to him and his employees, and what is their concern? All right, what are the police dealing with, and what are their concerns? What are the limits on what they can actually do? Is he asking them to do things that are really beyond the realm? I mean, there's a role for private security. Police are not your private security. And so if your objection is they're not stationed outside my restaurants the whole time, well, they're not going to be. They're not stationed outside my house all the time either. So it's like that's the role of private security.
And the article was kind of vague, like he doesn't have a specific instance where he called the police and they failed to respond or something like that.
Right.
And going back to your point about at the beginning, when he posted that, you had to expect a reaction. Not that I'm justifying the reaction.
No, not at all.
But we live in such a reactionary culture that, just like you're saying, it's sound bites and memes, and people are so quick to react.
Right.
And we're seeing that left and right. And
I think it just goes back to that. Do we want to be part of the solution? If we do, things like that don't get posted. Mm-hmm. If you want to be part of the solution to whatever agencies you're posting about, how do we work with others to be a part of that? And that's where churches too have this call, and maybe it's nothing new, but we maybe are going to try and live into this more. We're doing it with the food closet and our food ministries and those things. We want to be part of the solution. Mm-hmm. We have enough division already that we're going to get just by being Christian in some ways, because we're going to be labeled as whether homophobic or da 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 da. Sure. You're going to get labels put on there, but as long as we are working towards solutions to grow into this, and I think that's what we want to lift up. When we see everyone as created in the image of God, and no matter what expression of color is out there, that is part of the solution. That is part of our growth. That is part of seeing that by posting things about a system that we already know is broken. It feels like an attack on our own. How do we become parts of the solution? How do we become loving toward our neighbor, calling out what needs to be called out, but at the same time, being a part of the solution. I don't see that as being helpful whatsoever. Hobby Lobby gets picketed. I mean, for their stance on things. They're not suing the country,
the county.
Whoever. They're not.
Yeah.
I guess there's a disconnect for me between wanting to be a part of the solution and just wanting to be part of the circus.
Well, and it gets,
maybe that's too strong. I don't know. But.
Well, I'll tell you what it makes me think of. The whole lesson that hopefully we all learned as kids. When you get angry, don't respond until the next day. Take a moment to sleep on it. I know and confession time, this is a huge problem I have, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not throwing bricks through windows or anything like that, but when something happens that upsets me, I do have to try to make a concerted effort because you always have this feeling, it's like, I need to address this now.
That's our culture.
It is,
cultural
and
urgency.
you know what, when I do that, I'm never as clear-headed about it as when I wait and still address it. You don't want to not address something like that because you stew and it gets worse. But wait until you calm down. You can address it more calmly. The problem I think we have in our culture now is we're not giving people the breathing room to calm down. It's like, especially if you're on social media all the time, whatever it is that upset you, it's like, I want to say, don't post and respond to it right away. Like this, I think this guy probably did,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and then so what happens is, we want to respond right now. And then we say, okay, hold on, let me calm down, and I'll wait till tomorrow morning before I respond. But then by tomorrow morning, someone else posted something else. Maybe I'm saying, well, this got you angry. So
Stoke the fire, yeah.
Yeah, we're in this perpetual stage of outrage as a culture.
And it grieves me. If we would proclaim the gospel with the urgency that we proclaim problems, we'd be so much better off. We just don't. We'd rather throw the problems out there and just let those thrive instead of the gospel going. Because we have the answer as Christians. We have the answers, the truth, the love, and we're afraid to do anything because of the culture.
And I've said this a number of times in the show, but now you're here, so I get to say it to your face. And you're going to know what I'm going to talk about is the sermon you gave. I think some people misunderstood, in fauress. The first one, I think it was the first one you gave outside, I think it was, remember correctly, where you talked about the gospel, and the fact of the matter is you see all the stuff going on in the world today, and whatever you think is wrong, I mean, everybody thinks something's wrong in the world today. We may have differences of opinion about what it is and all that, but we all think there's something going wrong in the world today. Well, if you really believe that the gospel has the power to transform lives, then why aren't you out there sharing it more? Because all these things that you are complaining about that people are doing, they can be changed through the gospel. Right. So if anything, it's like, rather than spending your time, posting comments like this gentleman did, how about instead share the gospel? Because that's going to be more effective in the long run than stuff like this.
Is it faithful to the gospel? Before you hit send, is it faithful to the gospel?
I think your point too earlier about taking time to listen to people. We're so disconnected right now from people, where all we get is that sound bite, and then we're just reactionary to overreact, and then like you said, that fire gets stoked. And so take time, listen, and earn the right to be heard as well. When we're reaching people one-on-one for the gospel, that's when it spreads.
And listen, we're painting with very broad brushes. Yeah. We absolutely are, because it's culture this and culture that. The biggest thing we can do is see the person in front of us, have that relationship, just exactly what we were talking about.
Tim Foster comments here. He says, my recommendation in all of this craziness is to simply post, speak, proclaim words that lift up our neighbors. That's how Jesus spoke to the people when he walked the earth. Note, Jesus did not speak this way to the religious leaders of his time. He had harsh words for them. Sorry, Pastor Jay.
Right. Yep. He's not wrong.
He's not wrong. And you know why he's not wrong? Because, like it or not, you have a higher level of responsibility as a pastor. And there's a kind of an escalating scale, and I'm not a pastor, but I still, people especially see like this. We still have a higher level of responsibility. For nothing, even just being on the show. I mean, we're employees of Trinity, but it kind of moves up, and you're at the top of the Trinity ladder, I think, as far as But those that are in any kind of leadership position are you're going to be held to a higher standard, and you should be, and you should be. And that also gets back to a lot of this is another rabbit trail we could go down probably for hours on end. But the whole judging thing, where people talk about, well, Jesus said don't judge. hold on, slow your roll for a
Lest
minute.
ye be judged.
Yeah, and certainly within the church, we need to be free in love, to call out
one another in accountability.
Yeah,
Right.
to
And
hold
that's
our-
Matthew 18 too. There are ways to go about doing it that we choose to ignore. It begins with that one-on-one relationship.
Right.
If you want to follow the Matthew 18 model, which many folks say they do, it's go to your brother or sister first. Talk to them about it. Man, I just wonder if Jesus would have had Facebook, what that would look like. I really do. What would he post? What would it, man.
but
that'd
it
be
does.
awesome. Would it be passive aggressive? Would he just be kind of like, hey, everybody's, I think it'd be awesome.
I think
that's
here-
one of my questions I want to ask him. How would you treat
How would you
Facebook?
treat Facebook? Well,
Social media.
you know what I mean? Well, it's funny you mentioned that, though, because another thing I was thinking about the other day, and this gets back to our earlier story.
Jesus
about-
has a page, just in case. He's got quite a few pages, but I don't think they're actually his.
No, probably not. You'd hope he's proclaimed there, but
Yeah.
but he's not typing the keyboard. But anyway, it gets back to getting back to one of our earlier stories. I think too many people nowadays will presume to know. We have to keep the scripture in its cultural context, and we do our best to obviously bring that forward to today. But you have to keep in mind the context it was written in. You talk about, so I've seen people say, we should, where two or more are gathered in His name, therefore we should be gathering. Okay, but the internet didn't exist 2,000 years ago, so let's talk about what that means to be gathered in His name. Are you telling me that if you're having an online worship service that Jesus isn't present, because it's going out over the internet as opposed to you being physically in the same room?
So if that is, then can we do virtual communion?
Rabbit hole! See, I told you it's the rabbit hole we could go down. But that, hopefully the bishop's not watching. No, but that's an interesting. It's a tendency, I think, of people to become. Be careful not to substitute your own opinion for God's. And I think sometimes we tend to do that because we take things, we want something to be true, and so we'll kind of stretch the context.
Bringing us back full circle to the very first story. If you've taken God out of everything, you can make your own morality. And if God does not hold any importance to any of our decision making, this is where we're at.
Yeah, and for God to exist, and it just tying right into all of that, if I'm going to think of a God, then I want him to exist and to be real apart from my will, and if he exists apart from my will, then I should not expect him to agree with everything I think or you think or the culture thinks. He should think what he thinks and and allow him to be what he is and to say what he says. And so too often I think we want to impose or to impose our own views on God or put words into his mouth, into Christ's mouth, instead of letting Scripture speak for itself and letting him inform our decisions.
And Satan has a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
And he took the very first words and twisted them, and thanks, here we are.
Yeah.
And did God really say that if you there you go.
There
That's
you go.
the very first, example that we have
Yep.
of disobedience or whatever you want to call it. It's not an out, but this is where we're at now.
Yeah.
But to get back to that covenant piece, which we even talked about on that, God wants this covenant with us for us to partner with him and do all this. But we got to follow those rules that he has also given us, which we struggle with too.
All right.
Anyway,
So we don't go down any more rabbit trails.
you're not going to have me back. I know. That's okay.
No, we absolutely will. I've just, it's funny, you look back at the end of the conversation, it's like, we were talking about Vince's Crab House at one point.
Yeah.
But that's water
It all
cooler
kinda
conversation,
wraps
right?
together,
That's
yeah.
what it's really like. You go wherever it goes. So anyway, thank you everybody for our whole panel. And I forgot to mention, in case you can't tell, because I know sometimes the cameras make things that are 3 dimensions look 2-dimensional. But go on the wide shot if you're not there already.
Very far away.
Yeah, he is. We're in a T formation here. We are, because we've always made, Jen and I made a comment about, we used to have the chihuahuas hanging here, about this is a 6-foot table, so we are socially distanced, and I wanted to make sure you realize that my wife, who's the former math teacher, did the math on this to figure it all out. We're in a triangle shape here. Pastor Jay is not sitting right here in the middle of this table. He's on his own back there, so we are still socially distanced here as well. So, All right, well, thank you very much. That was a good conversation. I liked that. And I was a little worried with 3 people that we'd have more conversation. We'd go way over, but we didn't. We're right about where we've been hitting average-wise, so that's good. And thank you all very much for watching the show here today. Please, just a reminder, we are here every Monday at 12 noon. And of course, you can watch it anytime afterwards. If you're not watching it live, you still want to put a comment in there on YouTube or Facebook, please do so, and we'll try to catch up with it and comment on the next show. We're going to take a poll. Who thinks we should have Pastor Jay back? No, we're not. We're not going to do that. I mean, we will have him back. We're not going to have a poll. So that sounded really bad. And please go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are still trying to get up to that 1,000 subscriber mark. That does give us a lot more flexibility with it. Last I checked, we're at like 817 or something like that. So we're getting there, but we still got a little ways to go. So if you could share this video, share the channel, tell your friends about it, get them to subscribe as well. We'd really appreciate it. All right? So thank you, Pastor Jay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ken.
And thank you all for watching. See you next week. God bless.